we're going to cut our background fabric today for the Luna quilt. And this is not my favorite task, and to be honest, I usually do this step before I cut my feature fabrics, just so that it's out of the way, because I like cutting feature fabrics, but I hadn't decided on backing fabrics or background fabrics for either one of my quilts. So I put it later in the Quiltalong because I thought maybe some of you guys would be in the same boat. So this is the background fabric for my jelly roll friendly quilt, and my plan is to use a variety of low volume scraps, and I have a few fat quarters. I probably won't end up using, I don't know if those ones are too busy to use. I got to figure out what I need. I'm not 100% on what I'm doing there yet. So with the fabric is a strip that is cut from selvage to selvage. So see, I have my fabric here, which I've pressed. Press your fabric first. I have my fabric folded in half, which is how it usually comes when you buy it. And then I've folded it into quarters, and that's how I always cut my fabric. You want to make sure that your fabric is lined up nicely. Usually that will mean that not only are the selvage parallel to each other, you don't want, you know, one of them to be like this and the other one is like that. That means that your fabric is not straight. So I want to make sure that lines up nicely, and I want to make sure that this lines up with, usually I'll leave like a little bit of the selvage underneath so that I can see a consistent amount along the full length. So you can see that when this fabric was cut, it is not exactly straight, which is fine, because I'll square up. So one thing that you can do is to find where the straight edge is about an inch or so in. You can cut a piece, you can put a little cut mark here and then tear the fabric, and it will cut on grain. It's kind of scary to do. Practice maybe on fabric you don't love so much, or if it's something you've got extra fabric of. Okay, so normally in a pattern I will tell you how many width of fabric strips to cut, and I did not do that on this pattern for a variety of reasons, but the main one is that I think there's a lot of personal preference that comes into this, and it will just depend on what you're using. If your fabric is directional, meaning like this fabric is directional, it looks different this way than it looks this way. This fabric is not. It doesn't matter which way you turn it, it kind of all blends together. If you are making the lap and the baby size quilt, I would recommend cutting your fabric strips, not cutting 2.5 inch strips, but cutting the wider size and then subcutting it into 2.5 inch pieces. And I'm going to show you. If you're making the queen or the twin size, you can also do this, but you will need more fabric than the pattern calls for because it was not as efficient to do it that way. So you will need to cut 2.5 inch strips and then subcut the longer pieces from those. And just cut your full length of yardage. It says in the pattern how much yardage you need. Cut 2.5 strips all the way until you've used it all up. Cut your 10.5 inch pieces first, and then the next smallest size, and so on. So I'm going to show you using the way that I never do this anymore, which is my regular ruler, and then I will show you using my Stripology ruler. Actually, I'm going to start with the Stripology ruler, and so part of the reason why I like it is this is a ruler that I use all the time, and it is only 8.5 inches wide, which is fine most of the time because I don't usually cut fabric that's wider than that. And if I do, I turn the ruler this way, except for now it's not long enough. So I have other rulers that I could use, but it's much easier to use this one. Stripology XL ruler is 21 inches wide. So I've got my fabric folded into quarters, and now I'm going to line up one of these horizontal lines with the fold of my fabric up there. Make sure that I have room here to cut the fabric and room here for the rotary to go all the way through. Okay, I'm going to start by cutting a 10.5 inch piece. So right here I just squared up the edge, and then I'm going to cut 10.5 inches. And I actually need 2 I'm making the lap size, so I need two 10.5-inch pieces. And so that is 21 inches, which is, you can't see that here, the right off the edge of my, so I've got two pieces here. So now that I have those cut, I'm going to open them up like this, and I'm going to stack them on top of each other. From a width of fabric piece, you can get 16 pieces, 2.5-inch pieces, and I need 30 for the lap size, so that works out nicely. So I'll just end up with 2 extra, and those will just go in the scrap bin, which is fine. So I'm making sure I've got everything nicely layered. The nice thing about the Stripology ruler is it will show you right here, every square is 2.5 inches, so you don't have to do any math when you're cutting 2.5-inch strips. You just have to cut at every square. I'm lining up the cut edge with a horizontal line on my ruler. Just ignore all the reflections. I'm trying to pretend like it's not a gloomy Oregon day in here. And I'm going to cut 2.5-inch pieces all the way to the end. So that squares up the edge right here, and I'm going to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that gives me actually 32 pieces, and I only need 30, so I've got a couple of extra, but I will hang on to those. So now I'm going to cut the next size, 8.5-inch pieces. Make sure you're cutting from the background fabric cutting directions and not the feature fabric, because they are slightly different. All right, so now I've got my fabric again, and I am going to cut the next size, I cut the B5 pieces. Now I'm going to cut the B4 pieces, and you need the same number of each piece, so I'm going to cut 2 pieces again, but these ones will be slightly less wide, since B5 is 10.5 inches and these are 8. They're 8.5 inches wide, so I'm going to do new rotary blade. Why do we ever wait? 8.5, and then 8.5 times 2 is 17. Oh, that's nice. Let's cut these. I'm going to do the same thing now. I'm going to stack them. I like to put the fabric so that the selvage is facing up, so I can see where it is when I trim it off. Make sure I get it all the way trimmed off. I mean, the selvage is on the other side too, but it's wider on this side because that's where it's printed. You guys know what I mean. Okay. Make sure it's straightened up all the way, since I'm gonna cut all the pieces at once. Okay. And again, always line up the cut edge with a horizontal line on your ruler. And I'm just cutting at every square, which is the 2.5-inch increments. Okay. And there are my pieces. All right, now I will show you next how I would cut using a regular ruler. Okay. So I'm gonna just make sure this is still straight. I still had it sitting here, so it should be okay. Smooth it out. And the next pieces I need to cut are the B3 pieces. So those are 6.5-inch wide. And even though this is probably fairly straight from where I cut it before, I'm still gonna square up my edge. So I'm gonna line up the horizontal hashes on my ruler with the fold of the fabric. Remember, this is folded into quarters. And I'm gonna make sure I have more than 6.5 inches over here so that I can square up the edge. So I'm gonna cut here, 6.5. And then I'm gonna flip this over and square up the edge. So now I'll line up the 6.5-inch mark with my cut edge over here. I should have a horizontal line that lines up with the fold. It's a lot to keep in mind, but it's worth it to have fabric that's cut well, because you'll get better results. So there's a 6.5-inch piece. Now I should be squared up here since I just trimmed this, but I'm going to double check that when I line up this 6.5-inch mark here, that I also am lined up with horizontal hashes, and it looks good. So I'm going to cut 6.5. Now I'm going to open these up again, same as with the Stripology ruler. And I'm going to stack them together. This is 4 layers of fabric, so it should be plenty for my rotary cutter. And if you're making the baby size, you only need 1 of these strips. You don't need 2, because you only need to cut 12. So you'll end up with a little bit of extra, but you should have enough yardage in the fabric requirements that it's fine. Okay. So now I'm going to do the same thing, where I'm going to make sure I have 2.5 inches plus a little extra to square up, plus the selvage, so that I can square up in a minute. I'm lining up the horizontal hashes on my marker with the cut edge up here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut. Now I'm going to square this up. Now I'm just lining up the 2.5-inch mark here with the edge of my fabric. Trim off the selvage and square that up. So now I have that one cut. So now I'm going to go down the line, and every time before I cut, I'm going to make sure that the horizontal hashes are still lined up with the cut edge. So I'm just going to cut 2.5-inch pieces. This cuts 4 pieces at a time. So you can see that while this is not incredibly time consuming, it does take longer than the Stripology ruler. It's not a big deal if you don't make a lot of quilts, but I do make a lot of quilts, so it is a big deal to me. It saves me a ton of time. So I just scoot it over a little bit so you can see better, making sure it's still square. Looks good. So let's say I got to the next one and my horizontal lines did not line up. So what I'm going to do is make sure I'm going to line them up, the horizontal lines with the edge, give myself more than 2.5 inches so that I can cut it. Make sure it doesn't shift when you flip it over. And then square it up again. You can see mine was still pretty square. Okay, last one. There we go. Okay, so I still need to cut the 4.5 and the 2.5 inch pieces. I'm going to use the Stripology ruler. So I need 2 4.5-inch strips, 2 2.5-inch strips. It's always best when you're cutting fabric to cut your largest pieces first and just make sure that you get those out of the way, because you may end up with leftovers from cutting the larger pieces that are big enough to cut your smaller pieces. And if you cut the smaller pieces first, you will not end up with pieces left over that are big enough to cut your bigger pieces, if that makes sense. Okay, so again, lining up the fold with the horizontal line, and I'm going to cut 2 4.5-inch and 2 2.5-inch. So 4.5, I squared up, 4.5-inch plus 4.5 inches is 9. And I'm going to add 2.5, so that gets us 11.5. I'm going to add 2.5 again, which is going to get us to 14. Okay. So here's my leftover. I don't know exactly how much yardage I started with. And now I'm going to show you a little speed up trick that works especially well. If this isn't as effective if you're cutting the bigger pieces, because they won't fit under the ruler. So I'm going to roughly use the line on my cutting mat to line up the edge of this. I'm going to try to get it as close as possible. It's hard to see. When I put the ruler on top in a minute, we'll see how close I got. Okay, I got those here. I'm cutting all of these pieces now, even though they're different widths this way. I'm now going to cut them all 2.5 inches. So I'm going to cut them at the same time. And you can do this with either kind of ruler. You can do this with a regular ruler too. As long as you're careful that your fabric doesn't slip. Sometimes when you cut, the fabric on this side might move a little bit. You got to be careful about that. One nice thing about the Stripology ruler is that it holds your fabric in place. Okay, so now I have 2 places I need to make sure are lined up. I'm going to pick a horizontal line here and a horizontal line here. The nice thing about lining them up first on the cutting mat is that I know that they will now both line up with the line. If I just put it on the cutting mat, it might be in the middle somewhere here. This way I know they should line up with the line. And I'm going to cut 2.5 inch pieces. Square up. There we go. All my background fabric is now cut. I have another quilt's worth to cut. These are my extras, and I have all these pieces. My nice new rotary blade was very helpful in getting that done.